Good evening. So as we heard from Madhulika, the IMF program, the IMF solution is actually making the crisis worse. Now, if the IMF solution is making the crisis worse, what is the way out of this? This is the 17th IMF agreement, but the 17th IMF agreement is different because Sri Lanka has defaulted on its debt, and the IMF is considered the arbiter for debt resolution by the Paris Club, for example, and they require an IMF program for debt restructuring. So in that sense, the IMF has a stranglehold on us. What they say is if you don't have the IMF program, then you cannot have debt resolution. So what is the way out? The problem is that there is, first of all, a conflict of interest in the role of the IMF. The IMF is considered an arbiter for debt resolution, but the IMF is also a lender. And as we heard from Madhulika, this so-called IMF bailout, $3 billion US, it translates to just about $60 million US a month, whereas Sri Lanka's foreign earnings is 30 times that much, 1,800 million US. So there is no IMF bailout. But what the IMF is going to do to us is that over the next 10 years, for this $3 billion US loan, we are going to pay $2 billion US in interest payments. Right? So there is no IMF bailout, there is extraction by the IMF, while the IMF claims that it is the arbiter. So there is clearly a conflict of interest. So we have to think of other arbiters, other ways of restructuring this debt. And this is not just about Sri Lanka. This is the case for so many other countries in the global south. Now, how do we view this large debt stock? In the case of Sri Lanka, if we include all our external debt on the order of $51 billion US. First of all, it is justified that this debt should be reduced because over our post-colonial period, not only Sri Lanka, so many countries, there has been a constant extraction of countries like ours by the Western world through what is called the terms of trade, for example. Our exports earn much less and they earn much more by exporting to us. Much of this debt can be characterized as odious debt. This is not debt that benefited the people. This is debt that was used to extract from the Sri Lankan people by external creditors, as well as by our own elite, the people sitting in government today. And they are the ones who are deciding how this debt is going to be restructured. And finally, what do we do if we cannot repay this debt? Unless there is cancellation, there is no other way forward. So there are many justifications why this debt needs to be greatly reduced. But what is the IMF saying? According to the IMF, through this debt restructuring process, and the government has also come out and said they're just going to reduce it by 30%. Reducing the debt stock by 30% would mean our total debt, external and domestic together, is going to be 95% of our GDP. The next shock is just going to push us back into default. So this is not sustainable. While the IMF and the government might speak about 30% reduction of debt, the bondholders with whom the government is negotiating are talking about 20%, and even possibly 10% reduction of debt. In other words, they don't really care about Sri Lanka coming out of this debt crisis. The IMF, and to some extent our government, and definitely the donors, all they care about is that the creditors are repaid. That is the process. And once the creditors are repaid, what is the end program of this IMF program? What is the end goal of it? It is so that we can again go and float an international sovereign bond. It says that in the IMF agreement. Now, what needs to happen? This sort of debt resolution, this sort of debt arbitration is not going to take us anywhere. It is going to lead to the 18th IMF agreement and our second default. So what we need is a different process of debt arbitration. There might have to be a process maybe by another agency of the United Nations. We may have to convene a debt conference in Sri Lanka and start talking to the donors ourselves. We may have to make some tough decisions that maybe it doesn't make sense to go and borrow in the commercial markets. Because what did we do with our commercial market borrowing? Most of our international sovereign bonds, the interest payments were equal to the principal. We've already repaid the entire amount and more. And they want us to keep repaying. We might have to change the kind of economic policies that we take forward. If we allow our donors to decide, if we allow our elite to decide, we're going to have the highways, we're going to have the Lotus Tower. Does that lead to sustainable returns? No. We need a different process of development. We need planning, we need industrial policies, we need to deal with our food crisis, we need to focus on our food system. But these are policies that the IMF, the World Bank, the donors don't want us to take forward. They say no to industrial policies, while in the Western world, today, what is Biden doing? They're talking about industrial policies for the United States. The crisis in Sri Lanka is also about not planning. So we need to rethink all of that. So it is this kind of approach, and we can't do this alone. We need to link up with other countries that are in debt. We need a debtors coalition. We need to come together to be able to challenge the creditors. Sri Lanka by itself will be isolated, and this kind of restructuring will be imposed. But we all know the international financial system is broken. We need a new global financial architecture. Even the UN Secretary General has more or less come out and said this. Everybody knows it, but the political will has to come from our governments, not the kind of government that we have in power today. We need a different government. We need different governments around the world. But to start with, people's movements have to come together around the world and demand debt cancellation. So this is a large task, but we have to begin there. இறுதியாக நான் சில வார்த்தைகளை தமிழ்லையும் கூற விரும்புகின்றேன். இன்று நாங்கள் இந்த கடன் பிரச்சனை சம்பந்தமாக பேசிக்கொண்டிருக்கின்றோம். ஏற்கனவே முன்வைச்ச கருத்துக்கள் படி இந்த IMF உடைய சர்வதேச நாணய நிதியத்துடைய இந்த தீர்வு அல்லது திட்டம் என்பது ஒரு தீர்வு அல்ல. இதை எங்கள் மேலதிகமான ஒரு நெருக்கடிக்குள் தான் தள்ளிக்கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. இதிலிருந்து நாங்கள் வெளிவருவதாக இருந்தால் நாங்கள் வித்தியாசமான அணுகுமுறைகளை முன்னெடுக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. நிச்சயமாக இலங்கை போன்ற நாடுகளுக்கு, இது இலங்கை மட்டுமல்ல இவ்வாறான ஒரு கடன் நெருக்கடிக்குள் இருக்கின்றது. உலகத்தில் 50க்கு மேற்பட்ட நாடுகள் இவ்வாறான கடன் நெருக்கடிக்குள், ஒரு கடன் பொறிக்குள் விழுந்திருக்கின்றன. அதிலிருந்து நாங்கள் மீண்டெழுவதாக இருந்தால் இந்த கடன் அடிப்படையில் பாதிக்கப்படும் நாடுகள் இணைந்து அவர்களுக்கான ஒரு இணைப்பூடாக நாங்கள் கோரிக்கைகளை முன்வைக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. IMF இலங்கையுடைய கடன்களை தீர்க்கதிலும் பார்க்க IMF உடைய கடன் 3 பில்லியன் அமெரிக்கன் டாலருக்கான கடனுக்கு நாங்கள் அடுத்த 10 வருட காலத்தில் 2 பில்லியன் அமெரிக்கன் டாலர் வட்டியை கட்டப் போகின்றோம். இவ்வாறான உடைமை இழப்பு தான் இந்த IMF உடைய தீர்வு என்று கூட கூறப்படுகின்றது. அந்த விதத்தில் இவ்வாறு கடன்பட்ட நாடுகள் இணைந்து கோரிக்கையை முன்வைக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. ஆனால் எங்களுக்கு தெரியும், எங்களுடைய தற்போது இருக்கும் அரசாங்கமோ பல நாடுகளில் இருக்கும் அரசாங்கங்களும் இவ்வாறான தீர்வை முன்வைக்கப் போவதில்லை. ஆகவே மக்கள் இயக்கங்கள் மக்களுடைய போராட்டங்களூடாக மூன்றாம் உலகத்தை சேர்ந்த மக்கள் இணைந்து கோரிக்கைகளை முன்வைக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. நன்றி, வணக்கம்.